Thank you for the invitation to talk here at this very interesting and exciting symposium, and thank you for the nice introduction. Let me start right away. On the 18th of February 1975, demonstrators brought work to a standstill at the construction site of a nuclear power plant in Wyhl in southern Baden, as reported in the Badische Zeitung. Around 300 people arrived at the site at 11 a.m. and managed to stop the construction work without the use of force, and the work was stopped. While some demonstrators jumped on the excavator shovels, some hopped onto the bulldozers and tried to reason with the workers. Within an hour, every machine was idle, the newspaper reported. Most of the people present on that Tuesday morning were women, and the gathered journalists would have been hard-pressed to find an obvious ringleader. The best-known, mostly female faces of the protest: the local physician, the village pharmacist, the owner of a flour mill, were nowhere to be seen. They had just held a press conference in a forest cabin not far away. It was not until a woman on the sidelines of the conference suggested walking over to the site this confusing situation escalated. Despite the apparent mayhem, it was evident that the protest was well planned. The crowd at the site grew larger as the day progressed. Men whose wives, I quote, had gone down to Wyhl in the morning, arrived in the afternoon with bacon, thermoses of stew, and schnapps bottles in their jackets. By evening, tents had been sent up. Anti-nuclear activists from Baden and Alsace sat around crackling campfires, telling stories about the Second World War. The opponents of the nuclear power plant, with only a brief interruption after a police raid, remained at the site until November. Construction never resumed. The occupation of the site was not the only reason that the construction of the nuclear power plant was halted. Lawsuits and the fact that power from the planned power plant was simply not as urgently needed as in the early 1970s made the federal state government decide to stop, to halt the project. The greatest effect on the West German public, however, was by the occupation that was shown on TV. As early as the 1980s, social scientist Lisa Ruch described the Wyhl protest as the start of the German anti-nuclear movement. Historian Joachim Radkau wrote that they had caused an abrupt escalation of the conflict over nuclear power in Germany at Wyhl. The beginning of the German nuclear exit could be in Wyhl. Nevertheless, nuclear power was not phased out in Germany until almost half a century later. And the decommission of the last 3 German nuclear power plants in April 2023 did not end the history of nuclear power in the country altogether. Even if there will be no rethinking and no nuclear power plant will go on stream, the radioactive waste will accompany humankind over the next millenniums. Also, nuclear power plants are still in operation in several other European countries. In Finland, for example, at the time the last 3 German nuclear power plants went off stream, the 1,600 megawatt Olkiluoto power plant 3 went on stream. So what was the significance of protests like the occupation in Wyhl? What could a single local demonstration contribute towards such a long-lasting process? In order to answer these 2 questions, we must take a look at the Wyhl example and place it in its broader context. After all, the anti-nuclear movement was shaped not only by tireless work at a local level, but also by the way it was perceived elsewhere. Even if the Wyhl occupation is celebrated by many as the start of the anti-nuclear movement in Germany, at its core, the struggle is not fully understood. This is because the celebration of the occupation of the site has led to its mythologization of the event. As early as in March 1975, so briefly after the occupation started, Freiburg activist Freya Hoffmann warned, as you can see it on this slide, warned against interpreting the protest in this way. In Wyhl, she writes, I quote, individuals began pointing at the dangers of nuclear power plants and engaging in the difficult task of conscience raising. Leaflets were distributed, signatures, etc. were collected. As Hoffmann already knew at the time, this work was crucial not only for the subsequent success of the protests in Wyhl against the nuclear power plant and for the anti-nuclear movement as a whole. And in 1975, finally, when the construction site was occupied at the Upper Rhine, there was a tree national region covering Elsass, southern Baden, and northwestern Switzerland. Since the late 1960s, conflicts had been about the construction of nuclear power plants. In April 1971, a silent protest took place in France by 1,500 demonstrators against the nuclear power plant in Fessenheim. The protest in Wyhl began as soon as the project became known. So that was in summer 1973, as Hoffmann later reported. Opponents of the plan went door to door, collecting several thousand signatures to stop against a nuclear power plant. They also took part in public hearings. They formed citizens' initiatives to discuss their concerns and plan new campaigns together. But their petitions, objections, and even street protests and silent marches, tractor demonstrations did not show immediate effect. Initially, the government did not change its plans for the Wyhl nuclear power plant. It was not without reasons why local opponents of nuclear power decided already in late summer 1974 to occupy the construction site. They had begun to feel steamrolled by Baden-Württemberg, the power plant operators of the plant, and the government, which actively supported the project. Although the occupation they were planning was illegal, the protesters' original motives were not particularly radical. The opponents at the Upper Rhine described their project as apolitical. Many were primarily concerned with preserving their livelihoods in agriculture, especially in viticulture, or simply preserving their villages. However, the protests in the Upper Rhine Valley caused local concerns to spread beyond agriculture as the public gained a new understanding of nuclear power and the problem itself. In Wyhl and at many other sites of planned nuclear power plants, local residents attempted to assess the dangers and risks connected to the construction of nuclear power plants. They felt soon that the problem went beyond isolated impacts on the areas immediately surrounding nuclear power plants. In order to research this knowledge, new independent research institutes were established. For example, the Öko-Institut in Freiburg, founded in response to the debates over the plant in Wyhl in 1974. Its goal was, as you can see it on the slide, was to provide scientific information to concerned residents so they could participate more effectively in decision-making processes. These institutes and the public's desire for more information contributed to a broader scientific debate and provided new impetus for environmental policy. However, the disputes over individual nuclear power plants had consequences that went far beyond environmental policy. The anti-nuclear protests also led to extensive criticism of the government and even of the current state of democracy, because when opponents of nuclear power approached their representatives and members of parliament with their concern, they soon learned that these elected officials had little interest in their problems. The resulting learning processes led to the most important consequences for the movement. They deeply affected individuals and also had a broad social impact. In 1981, when asked about how the battle over the nuclear power plant in Wyhl had affected her and her family, winemaker Annemarie Sacher, who you see here on this picture, responded that it changed their lives in important ways. The discussion about nuclear power opened her eyes, she said. And she and her family became aware of the, I quote, environmental damage caused by the reallocation and consolidation of farmland, by the excessive road construction, the pollution of the Rhine, and the reckless use of herbicides. Furthermore, they also understood that values such as the preservation of health, life, and peace were not things to be taken for granted. This new understanding of basic human values came with a new perspective on politics. According to Sacher, she learned that these basic values, I quote again, were not necessarily guaranteed even under democratically elected governments. She ultimately decided to run for local government to promote the preservation of health, life, and peace. Sacher's answer to her basic values, distrust in democratically elected government, was not unique. After participating in demonstrations at the sites of planned nuclear power plants in Brockdorf and Groningen, Karl Bedermann, for example, decided to found an environmental protection party that would field candidates for the 1978 elections in Lower Saxony. According to Bedermann, his main goal was to use the ballot box to send a message to politicians who had done nothing but demonize opponents of nuclear power plants that far. But involvement in election campaigns was not the only way. Anti-nuclear activists demonstrated that they had expanded their understanding of political participation. As part of the protest movements, new corporations and partnerships were created. Christian Democrats from rural regions protested alongside Freiburg students at times when memories of the Second World War were still very much alive. French, Germans, and Swiss made common cause. Alternative civil society organizations also flourished, including the Wielerwald Adult Education Center was established, but had been established on the occupied site in Wyhl. 10 years after the occupation, the center was still organizing lectures in the surrounding villages. Radio Werte Fessenheim, a pirate radio station, as it was established at that time, and which is still in operation today, also traced its origin to the conflicts over the Wyhl plant. Democracy-enhancing effects of the anti-nuclear protests were not restricted to individual people in particular regions, but in fact much broader in scope. Petra Kelly, who later co-founded the Greens, regarded the local protests against nuclear power as a chain reaction that linked grassroots campaigns at places such as Lipp-Lötschak, Markolsheim, Wyhl, Brockdorf, and Kaiser Augst in France, Switzerland, and Germany. But these local campaigns, Kelly said, also represented a viable model for a broader alternative political platform that could cut even national borders. Kelly believed that the chain reaction of local protests, including the Wyhl occupation, should be brought to the European Parliament in Strasbourg. The first direct elections to the European Parliament in 1979 would be a critical battle against nuclear power plants, according to her. She hoped to permanently change the European Parliament in Strasbourg by harnessing, as she said, counter forces, including women, feminists, regionalists, opponents of nuclear power and military service, citizens' initiatives, eco-socialists, federalists, etc. Petra Kelly's critical battle against nuclear power did not take place in 1979. The European elections had no significant impact on nuclear policy in Germany or elsewhere. With the Greens, with Kelly as their leading candidate, received just 3.2% of the vote, and due to the 5% hurdle that applied throughout Europe, did not win a single seat in the European Parliament. Petra Kelly's metaphor of the chain reaction of local protests would have a greater overall impact was not wrong despite the European election. In 1986 at the latest, after Chernobyl, the results of the long-year decentralized work of nuclear power opponents are clear, because in the months after Chernobyl, the German population contributed its knowledge and began looking for alternatives. When federal, state, and local governments remained divided over the best policy response and were unable to protect the public with a uniform set of measures, citizens turned to independent research organizations like the Öko-Institute. They also established around 400 new local energy transition committees to study and implement local alternatives to nuclear power. So, looking beyond the history of the beginnings of the anti-nuclear movement in Germany, beyond the debates over individual power plants and nuclear power itself, we see a history of changing political participation. It is also a history of change of political participation. It is about the emergence of new heterogeneous groups, a remarkable willingness to get involved in public debates, and finally a search for alternatives. Even if these developments have not eliminated the risks of nuclear power, they have had far-reaching consequences, because the anti-nuclear movement gave people the opportunity to align politics more closely with their own interests, concerns, and ultimately their lives. Only as a result of this public participation was the anti-nuclear movement able to change public opinion and help phase out nuclear power. Thank you very much.